get some wah-wah in our voice? I don't know how loud that is. Loud? I'm gonna yell.
This is good.
Okay, we'll be quiet.
It's so heavy on this side, I wonder why.
We were sitting right there.
Oh yeah, that's where we were. Perhaps it begins with the intention of generating community through performance. Or perhaps it begins by asking what it means to create and present performances in theaters, galleries, found in site-specific venues, garages, warehouse, basements, parks, underground car paylots, benches, boiler rooms, etc. And what it means to make the city streets an active participant in the creation of our work. How could two selfish, privileged, middle-class kids from Calgary, a Western Canadian colonialist settlement turned oil-rich suburban spoiled brat, possibly develop a pedagogy and methodology that is motivated by radical politics? A pedagogy and methodology that is anti-racist, pro-feminist, and community-oriented. Perhaps we sought to put the city, our bodies, and our identities into crisis by transgressing and transforming coordinates, turning them into spaces where myth, community, and identity could come into being, if only temporarily.
Perhaps it begins with a party in which all the kids want to dance, but none of us know how.
Or perhaps, good man. Or perhaps it begins like this. My mother opens the car door and Samuel and I enter with tattered plastic bags containing slippers, beheaded stuffed animals, whispers of dead dogs, letters from past lovers, abandoned photographs of children from unknown communities, tablature of Green Day songs, and broken beer bottles. These are the building blocks of a narrative only the two of us will know.
Perhaps it begins like this. Of all the readings I have done, this is the only one I have difficulties talking about. I converted Eric's poetry manuscript into origami. At the time, I was in love with Deborah, even though my friend Dave said she was fat, and she was in love with James. Eric gave me a stack of poetry to read, to edit, perhaps 100 pages worth, and I said, okay, I will do it. Eric's poetry was a struggle. I thought his ideas were great, but they were impossible to find on the page. He was unintentionally enigmatic, cryptic, and vague, attributes my work shared, but I could not admit this at the time. We would sit down, perhaps across the street from Sate, and he would explain a poem, tell me where it came from, and it would be exciting. But sooner or later, I was compelled to point out, the idea is good, but it's not in your poem. 1999, the year I received Canadian citizenship.
Does it begin like this before it begins at all? Samuel is a princely man, big hair and big heart and big voice. I am small but madly in love with a woman who, in play, is the object of my desire. In reality, a bitch, I imagine, has sex with dogs. In play, I kill a man for this woman. I forcibly drive a sword through his heart. In play, I am a murderer. I am the thing I hate most. Not a man driven to murder by love, but an actor who imagines himself deep in the throes of another reality. A man who fakes his own death with fake poison and fake love and fake lighting and fake notions of gender and sexuality at the foot of some dog-fucking bitch from high school now famous for her role in Ghost World.
I don't know how many hours it took to change Eric's poetry into animals. I made rabbits, butterflies, and cranes. I made pigs, cats, dinosaurs, and frogs. There were also boats, boxes, airplanes. I tried to make roses, but they were too difficult. I made spaceships and canoes, fortune tellers, and ninja stars.
Did it begin with political struggle and revolts of imagination? Did it begin with an instance that the knowledge our mothers produced inside the official institution was merely wives' tales, but on the ground experiential and participatory knowledge? Did it begin with wanting to shoot dead the matrixial system of power that still, to this day, shape and govern our behaviors? Did it begin with African art critic Akwe Enwezor? Did it begin with the hope that by rethinking or redoing performance, we could develop a model of political and intellectual authority? Did it begin with the reconceptualization of everyday practices as both resistive and creative? Did it begin with two individuals who reflexively and infectiously implicated themselves in the creation of flawed, articulated, and collaborative communities? Did it begin because of this thing we call being alive as a political project?
It sometimes begins like this. We started collaborating in 1997 when Eric was Romeo and I the prince in our high school play. Ever since then, I have felt like an authority figure.
Perhaps it begins like this. We are drunk and stupid and walking towards the sounds of a cappella Woody Guthrie songs are 33 ducks, one with a broken leg.
Perhaps it begins like this. Hit it, Joan.
This work began over a decade ago. I was preparing a book of poetry, the second in as many years, and I asked Samuel if he would consider acting as an editor. This was perhaps the official beginning of our collaborative relationship, though I can recall several bike rides, phone conversations, Monopoly games, high school plays, he the prince and I Romeo, watermelon feasts, and high school graduations. Back then, in 1999, I fashioned myself as a poet. I would sit in cafes dreaming, reading David McFadden, Gandhi, and Robert Crumb. But of course, back then, everything was poetry to me. A dog shitting on some grass, the heartache I felt when Ross and Rachel broke up, receipts from the roastery, or the funeral of a junior high school friend. 6 weeks into the process, Samuel arrived at a coffee shop and dumped a bag full of origami animals onto the table and said, "Your poetry doesn't move me." So I moved your poetry. When I asked Samuel to edit a book of poetry for me, I did not expect that he would anticipate Norman Denzin's assertion that if the world is representation, then to change the world, we need to change how we perform and write it.
Perhaps it begins like this. I wanted to do a computer science degree, but that was hard. So I gave it up. I wanted to do a math degree, but that was hard. So I gave it up. I wanted to do an English degree, and then I didn't want to do that anymore.
I remember the beginning being Samuel's return from China. He had grown a handsome but large beard, a post-9/11 mistake. And in the hour that I am waiting for him at the airport, I imagine his belongings scattered across a nondescript made-in-China stainless steel table. I imagine his dignity in shatters, the cheeks of his ass split apart by the force of some racist border guard searching for drugs, bombs, plans of attack, or foreign meat. And I imagine us, late into the night, dressed as Hitler's henchmen, blowing the shit out of every government building in the land, slitting the throats of every bad artist, burning every book of Canadian poetry, save for David McFadden's Gypsy Guitar, and finally pissing on the theaters before we drive a stolen vehicle off a cliff into Fish Creek Park.
Perhaps it begins with a plan. I dumped 100 folded poems onto a coffee table on the corner of 10th Street and Kensington Road, and then I walked out on Eric. I can't remember which way I went, or how long it was before we talked again. In my head, it took months. I was afraid to see him.
Or our beginning's this. Broken-hearted and driving away from Lethbridge at 180 kilometers per hour.
It all began with a mountain fall.
Every beginning I ever remember has to do with an open map, a restless sister, a broken-down priest, a hatred for bald men, and a drunken dog.
I feel uncomfortable. It begins with discomfort.
Every beginning begins like this. We are sitting looking out the window of a cafe when Samuel suggests